let's briefly introduce ourselves. Victoria, give a legal perspective on things for us.
Hi there, I'm Victoria Marcham and I'm one of the employment lawyers at Knights PLC, and I work flexibly myself. I work 2.5 days per week, and I sort of specialise in writing and giving employment law training to employers about issues such as this, and I also do business development as well for Knights. So that's me.
That's great.
Yeah.
Nigel, you tell us about the pitfalls and otherwise of working with IT.
Yes, I'm Nigel Ridpath. I work for Flex IT. My role in the organisation is to really help people maximise the investment that they're making in IT. And we're increasingly being asked questions around how we can use technology to support people to work flexibly. So we'll cover some of those topics this morning.
Indeed, and Diane, people working with a disability flexibly is important to you.
Yes, very much so. So I'm Diane Lightfoot. I'm Chief Executive of Business Disability Forum. We're a not-for-profit membership organisation, and we support around 300 businesses, from FTSE 100 companies to local authorities to universities, to get better at recruiting and retaining disabled people, and also at serving disabled customers. And one of the top topics to our advice service is reasonable adjustments, and flexible working is actually the biggest reasonable adjustment in the UK and can make a huge difference.
Certainly can, and that's been proved by the statistics that we saw from you, Louise. Let's look at changing minds first of all, shall we? Clearly, in the UK, we have the attitude seems to be moving into the right direction, but there's still some uncertainty among employers, particularly, about encouraging people to work flexibly. Let's take what's the legal perspective on that, first of all, in Victoria, in terms
of employer obligations and employee rights. So basically there are various rights and protections that employees do have, and the most universal of those is the flexible working regulations, the rights under that. This came into force in 2014 on the 30th of June, and basically all employees are entitled to ask to work flexibly. Prior to that, it was only those who were caring for children or people with a disability, for example. But now everyone can ask to work flexibly if they've had 26 weeks service, and they can only ask once in every 12-month period. And the employer can only say no on the grounds of one or more of 8 reasons, which are sort of specified in the guidance. So such as the burden of additional costs, or planned structural changes, or insufficiency of work during the periods that the employee proposes to work. So for example, if the employee says, I want to come in at 6 o'clock in the morning, but we do sort of work in a call centre and calls don't start coming in till 8 o'clock, then that would be a reason to say no to that request, for example. But then employers have to be careful, because there are other rights that employees do have if they're in sort of certain protected groups. So they would have a protection under the Equality Act. So if they were mums wanting to work part-time to care for their children, then there's a potential for indirect sex discrimination. Or if they are a disabled person, they can claim disability discrimination if they are refused their rights or their a request to work flexibly, and there's no justification that the employer can provide to say no. So it's much harder for an employer to say no based on the Equality Act protections, but equally the protection under the flexible working regulations, those reasons, those 8 reasons that employers can cite, are not to be looked at as a tick box exercise. So lots of employers kind of go, oh, I think I'll say that one, and that one, but they haven't actually investigated whether those reasons are factually correct. And so a tribunal wouldn't look on that very favourably at all. And so if someone has asked to sort of do a job share and the employer said, oh no, we couldn't find someone else to do that other half of that job, the tribunal might say, well, where did you advertise that post, and how many people applied, and why did you say no to those people? You know, so
because companies aren't always telling employees the facts, I guess.
Exactly.
The onus seems to be on the person who wants to work flexibly to come forward.
I think so, and I think a lot of employers are a bit scared, and they often phone us up when they've been asked by one of their employees to work flexibly, and they instantly think, I don't think this is going to work. And it has been our job then to talk to them and say, look, hang on, let's just take a step back. Let's think a bit more creatively. Let's think of ways that we might compromise on this, or maybe trial the flexible working request and see how it goes. So we try to help employers to sort of, look into it more creatively and to have a positive mindset. And that's where the tribunals would want to see as well. If an employee did complain, they'd want to see that you as an employer had thought creatively, had been positive and proactive.
And are you seeing more people coming forward to look at things from a legal point of view, you think?
Oh yeah, because I think more people are asking to work flexibly.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously lots of organisations already have a culture of that and they're doing really well with that, and that's fantastic. But I think for those, especially when they've never had someone ask before, it can be quite daunting for them.
Sure. Diane, have you come across any perception with other colleagues that people think those who are working flexibly, perhaps part-time, are kind of not as much team players, they're not as worthy of doing the job as they are?
I'm not sure people actually would maybe voice that, but certainly people can worry that jobs aren't getting done. And I think going back to what Louise was talking about, I was going to talk about an outcomes focus. So really looking at what somebody is doing and achieving rather than measuring the amount of emails they send, and actually focusing and measuring the things that matter. I do think that the team building part is really important. So if people are regularly not in the office, making sure that there are good other forms of internal communication so that people stay in touch. I think I more often hear it the other way around, that people who are working remotely feel that they are excluded from, the day-to-day life, the day-to-day banter and information of what goes on in the office. So making sure that they are kept included and kept up to date is equally important, as I think is sort of setting out kind of expectations really about how often people are in the office if they are remote working, so that people do maintain that kind of relationship and team building and contact.
And that's technology, your kind of area really, isn't it, Nigel, in terms of clearly technology has got better, but in some ways perhaps it is taking away that human contact, that face-to-face contact that we have. That can be something that people who work flexibly miss. Yes, no, that's true. In our organisation, we've actually taken on 2 members of staff into our support team in the last 2 weeks. And, if I was just thinking about, while we were talking about how difficult it would be for them to feel part of the family, part of the Flex family, if they weren't sitting by, their new colleagues, over some period of time, and there are some challenges there if the workforce is a bit more dispersed. That's not to say that there aren't solutions around those sorts of things. We're seeing an increase in pickup in kind of peer-to-peer video conferencing with people in different locations. So we're starting to see that come through. We're also seeing an increase in instant messaging over email these days. And that's a bit of a shift in direction from the way we've tended to work for the last. Do you mean things like Instagram and what? No. I mean by that more the kind of WhatsApp type messaging, not using WhatsApp necessarily, but using that ability to do quick messages between people rather than the slightly more formal email, transmit and receive. So how concerned are employers about security with that type of thing, though? They are concerned, and in fact, with instant messaging, and certainly I have daughters 19, 21. They never send emails to anybody. Everything is about messaging, and if you're bringing in employees under about 30 these days, they see that as being the way that they want to work, rather than they see emails as kind of rather prosaic, really. But yes, security is important around those things, and there are solutions out there which can make those messaging channels secure and indeed more useful, because it is possible to include those messages in searches within the organisation. So you can you may recall some instant message conversation you had with somebody about some topic, and actually that's searchable now. What about if you want to have a 2 or 3 way phone conversation with someone, as we tend to do in business areas? You can't necessarily do that from home just on your mobile, can you? No, but again, there are PC-based technologies where that's becoming more and more common. I mean, Skype was mentioned earlier, and that technology is actually evolving. Many of you may know that Microsoft bought Skype some years ago now,
And there's actually a functionality within Skype now where those audio calls can be transcribed, and in fact that becomes part of your searchable knowledge base. So those conversations are becoming easier. The critical point then becomes the internet connectivity, which is something that you brought up in your talk, Louise.
Yeah. Let's think about who will benefit from flexible working. We've discussed mothers, but what are the other demographics, Louise? Who else can benefit from or is benefiting from flexible working that we might have to think about and think, do you know, that could work for me?
Well, potentially everyone in throughout their working lives, but I think the needs might change. And I think, you know, as you progress through your working life, there are different demands and different expectations and different, you might have different ambitions. So yes, younger people coming in without any responsibilities may actually appreciate flexible working as a solution to how they're working, and also expect it in terms of how they want to work. So that might be quite alien to some of us who, you know, I remember a job I had when I was clocking in and clocking out. You know, that was seems like it's long gone. And then you have the issues of parents and children and how to cope with care and how to cover for care and health and that kind of thing. But you also have people who want to develop other interests, so that work isn't the only interest that is driving them throughout their lives. They have other things they want and want to create and develop for themselves, through to older people, and it's an aging working population who, you know, the needs change and people become ill and need looking after, and there are different sets of decisions to be made then. So I think potentially everyone.
And I think it's so interesting to see what the statistics were on the job satisfaction, that it appears that people who are working flexibly appear to be more content with the work situation, really. So I think that's something to
and can manage some of the stresses and pressures that work bring. Being devil's advocate, there's another side to that, and it's linked to the technology. And you see a lot of discussion about, so when am I not working? I am always connected to the internet. I'm still email era, but you know, some companies put an embargo on emails after a certain time. Because our expectations about quick, rapid responses to a question, you know, I've sent an email and they haven't answered me, you know, it's an hour later, let alone, you know, if I'm working 2.5 days a week, it might not be till next week. Well, that seems like a lifetime. How many of us are online in the evening, just checking our emails, you know, while we're watching telly, not letting our partner know that's what we're doing, or at the weekends.
And that could be even worse with instant messaging, of course. I mean, the clue's in the title. And you
it's like a Pavlovian effect, isn't it? Ping, and you must respond.
Trust has got to be a big issue, though, hasn't it, as well? Certainly on the side of the employer, we've got to take a more grown-up attitude, perhaps a more contemporary way of thinking about, you need to trust people to come up with the goods and perhaps be less rigid.
And also have the outcomes base that you mentioned. Think about work differently in terms of what needs to be done by when.
I was just reflecting early today that I've spent 20 years, I know it can't possibly be true, working in the voluntary sector. And thinking back, the first time I worked for, they were absolutely rigid about everyone had to be there by 9, and you obviously didn't leave before 5. And I can remember various people being hauled over the coals for getting in at 2 minutes past 9 or something. And then I moved jobs, and I'm not going to name that organisation. And then I went to work for another organisation, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations. And one of the first things they said to me was, I expected you wouldn't be allowed to look at the internet, because this was when the internet was starting to become a thing. And we never thought it would catch on, but it did. And they said, well, we don't, as long as it's sort of appropriate stuff, you can look at what you like. We're not going to monitor what you do, but we expect you to get the job done. And that was just such a breath of fresh air after the previous one. And then they said, you know, the core hours here for everybody are, going back to Louise's point about flexibility, the core hours are 11 till 3. We expect you to be here 11 till 3. Other than that, we don't mind which hours you do around that. And I would like to add to Louise's point about flexible working potentially being good for everyone, which I completely agree with, that it can be particularly good for disabled people. And we know that disabled people can also be parents and mothers and fathers, of course, because we don't all sit in one box, are disproportionately unrepresented in the workplace. And adjustments such as being able to work from home because public transport is really difficult, or working flexible hours so that you don't have to travel in rush hour because if it causes acute anxiety, can be really, really simple things that can make the difference between somebody staying in work or not. So I think it's really, really powerful.
You work flexibly, Victoria.
I do, yeah.
How has that worked for you then? What's been your experience? What was it like when you started out doing that?
Well, I haven't done it any other way, because when I had my first baby, I came back to work after that working 2.5 days a week. Though I did have a very nice conversation with my boss. It was brilliant. I went to a cafe with him and the baby, and I had it in my mind that I'd like to work for 2 days. And he obviously thought that he'd like me to work 3 days. And so I sort of said, well, perhaps I could work 1 day from home. And he said, well, might be quite tricky for you with a baby. I, sort of had ideas about my little one doing a jigsaw whilst I was on the laptop, and, had no idea. And he said, well, what about working half a day from home and doing that whenever you can, if the baby naps or, in the evening. And that was the start of my flexible working journey. So I was very lucky to have a very, sort of lovely and supportive boss.
Would you do anything different?
No, I mean, for me at the moment, this is a perfect situation. I have got 3 days where I'm off at home with the children, and I do work on those days to kind of, make up my half day. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, I'm in the office, I'm focused, or I'm seeing clients, or I'm doing presentations, whatever. And I feel very much engaged when I am there. So I feel like when I'm there, I'm giving it my all, and I'm really enthusiastic. I've got a lot to do in that time that I'm there. But I enjoy my work. I feel like it's a real privilege to do what I do. I feel I'm very lucky, and I'm very loyal to my employer. I think I don't want to move jobs because I've got the ideal job. And, perhaps that will change when my littlest one goes to school. When she goes off to school, perhaps I'll want to work every day and then maybe leave early to go and collect them from school. But at the minute, I think it works brilliantly. I don't take many sick days, and, I feel, rested, and that I've got a nice work-life balance. I mean, sometimes it is hard and you feel like you're juggling and you're not balancing it and you're dropping the balls and things, but overall I feel very privileged and very lucky to have supportive employers and to have that time with my children.
Yeah.
Because my mum worked full-time and I didn't have her around.
You don't get that time back.
And so I said, I don't want to do that. I want to be at home with my children. Sadly, she didn't have the choice that I have, but I have the choice, and I've chosen to do this, and I'm enjoying it.
The journalist side of me also will say, well, what's the downside? Have you had negative experiences that people have had, or people indeed who wanted to kind of go back to the way things were before?
One of the things we were thinking about was whether it's increased. And I think flexible working has increased, but there are still a surprising number of companies, both in the UK and internationally. I was surprised to see Japan actually being good on flexible working, because when I was talking to a group of officials from the Japanese equivalent of the Department for Work and Pensions, if you can imagine such a thing. And for them, the idea of being able to work from home or working different hours was really, very, very challenging. And there are still some businesses where that is challenging. I think the difficulty is also where there are very different roles within a business. And going back to your point around, can it cause resentment? And generally, I would say if you can offer it as an option to everybody, then that's got to be good for everybody. And then people don't have to say why they need it. But there are always going to be some roles, like a receptionist role or a customer facing role, where you can probably do different shifts, but you aren't going to be able to work from home, for example. So those kind of things, I don't think it's possible to remove any kind of tension around that. But then if you have the whole kind of menu that Louise was talking about around compressed hours and working times and career breaks, if you add that into the mix, then I think that can go a long way as well. Senior
management is going to be a tricky situation to be in, potentially, isn't it? In terms of perhaps the higher up the chain you go, the more you're expected to be present kind of 24/7 almost.
Well, potentially, but we've got a charity client who has recently taken on a joint CEO role. So they're, so they've got a CEO role where it's done by 2 people and they do a job share. And they're saying it works brilliantly. So I think we have to challenge those stereotypes and think creatively and think, well, why have we thought that couldn't possibly be done part-time or as a job share, because maybe it could. Trial it, see if it works.
So we all need to show solutions, basically, and say, look, this is what works.
Yeah.
As an employer, would you not potentially rather have someone who was working into your timetable and your rules and regulations, rather than someone who is going to say, I want to work X hours this day, then I won't be in the next day, but the following day I'll be in the afternoon, that kind of thing.
In our organisation, we have a support desk that needs to be manned between certain hours, and that does provide us with certain constraints that we've got to work around. Having said that, from our perspective, there is flexibility around some of the more project type work we do, where the job just needs to get done within a time frame, coming back to the outcomes focus, and we can provide some flexibility around that. So I was thinking about some of the industries that, for which this is going to be particularly difficult. If you're making parts or minis, or manufacturing is going to be one of those industries where this is going to be very, very hard to do. But we're an 80% service industry, and that should mean that we're a lot higher up than bottom of the list, really. And I think it just is a bit of imagination.
Well, open up to the floor in just a tick. One question: who pays for the technology? If I'm using my broadband at home to pay to use work, documents on, sending things, working on the computer all day long, mobile phone, etc. How much of that could I end up actually coming out of my bill? How do you separate these things?
Have we got any tax people in the audience? I mean, we do have to be a bit careful around these. Generally, people have some sort of internet connection that is domestically based. You can work out some reasonable portion of that to be expensed back to your employer. I think most employers, if you're looking at a few pounds a month compared to office space, for instance, is a bit of a no-brainer. And those sorts of things, but you do need to be careful. You can't expense the whole your whole internet bill if a fair proportion of that is being used for your kids to watch YouTube.
Sure. Sure. Is there any evidence that people working from home could potentially be paid less that you've come across?
It shouldn't be the case. I'm just thinking of kind of where somebody might have opted to go part-time and reduce down from a full-time job, working from home, but actually doing more hours than their part-time contract allows for. So in that case, yes, they would be earning less.
It does raise it.
I think it's part of this kind of, when am I working, when aren't I working? How do I clock off?
Sure.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Being able to work from home, because then you have this problem that when you do come home and you kind of think, I want to spend time with the kids, am I just glued to my phone and trying to get emails answered and things like that? It's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think we have to be careful that we don't kind of use this tool that's meant to be something that enables us to have a better family life, to actually destroy our family lives.
The other thing I noticed in the news, I think it was last week or the week before, is a move to say that actually commuting time should be counted as part of your work time, because if you're working while you're on the train, or you're working, shouldn't that be counted as part of it rather than outside your working hours? So that's another kind of dimension to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure a lot of full-time employees are going to say that one as well, wouldn't they? Okay, let's all flex together today. Let's open it up. If anybody have any questions they'd like to put to any of our panelists at this time? Yeah, okay, can you wait till we get the... we've got some online, is that right, Jenna?
One question online.
Okay, we'll bring the mic over to you and we'll see what the question is.
Thank you. We may have covered it already, but Angela online has asked what the biggest barriers are to flexible working. And I guess trust is a factor, and security. But if there's anything else, a major factor that you think is a big barrier, then Angela would like to know.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Who'd like to take that one? Beyond what you said,
I'll give a partial answer to that, because there are some broader points. But we find from a technology perspective, it is internet connectivity that is actually the biggest technical barrier to flexible working. We're still not there with proper super fast broadband in all areas in this country. We're lagging behind the rest of Europe, and really, I think in order to move this whole area forward, it might seem like a rather dull barrier, but actually getting better internet connectivity out more broadly is a big point.
And I'd just add that if by flexible working, Angela means working from home, then it's having a space in the home environment that is conducive to work.
I was going to say fear is one of the biggest barriers, I think, from employers who think that flexible working means a dip in productivity. So I spoke to an employer recently and I talked about this day and I said, what about encouraging your staff to work flexibly on that day? He said, but what about the dip in productivity? I mean, I can't justify that. And, his sort of initial reaction was, oh no, it's this will damage our business. Whereas actually, studies have shown that people can be more productive when they're either working from home or they're coming in earlier and they're working when they're most productive. They're if they're an early riser, they're brilliant between 6 and 10 in the morning, and you're getting the best out of them. So I think it's the fear that it's going to be a bad thing and that it means that people would just be really relaxed and not do any work.
I mean, to be honest, sometimes you're more likely perhaps to be overcompensated for that, maybe to work even harder because you are concerned that people will have this perception that, they're slacking or whatever.
Yeah,
I think it's tricky. Yeah.
The other one I've heard is around sensitivity of data and information.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine, actually, where she works, they have a blanket ban on people working from home. So again, that definition of flexible working, because of the things that they're dealing with, and they're actually not allowed to take any paperwork home, and they're not allowed to email stuff. So that can be an issue as well.
How do you send files securely?
There are all sorts of solutions to that, and yes. They want to talk to it. It's absolutely doable. It's actually papers are more of a problem than you can have complete management of devices, and that's what we're looking at. There's encryption. There's being able to securely access files either back in base or in the cloud. These are well-trodden paths these days.
Okay. I think that employers would have to be careful about saying no to someone asking to work flexibly on that basis, if there is the technology available to be able to protect that data. It depends if you're working for like GCHQ or if you're working for a law firm, because obviously, we deal with lots of sensitive data. We have encryption, we have passwords, and we can do it. So I think you just have to be very careful, because in saying no, particularly if someone is protected under the Equality Act and they're a disabled person or a carer, then you're on sort of murky ground there.
Okay, great. Any questions from here? Let's go to the gentleman first. If you wait till the mic gets over, and then we'll get everyone else in as well.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. I work for Aylesbury Vale District Council. First of all, it was a bit of a statement, really, as someone who works flexibly, and then just a wider question. So, first of all, I joined the authority a little under a year ago, looking for flexible working. That was a lot to do with supporting actually my wife's role, and she wanted to try a new job, and that was going to require more travelling. We have 3 young children, but actually fundamentally I just got to a stage where I was like, is this really how life needs to work? But then that sort of leads on to sort of my question a little bit, which is how do we change the culture widely around men and flexible working? So the word mum has come up a lot today, and I understand why that is, but I fear that there's a little bit where you turn it into flexible working's kind of a nice to do for people to fill some time. I work full time flexibly. So when I talk to people I work flexible, they say, oh, you're part-time. No, I'm not part-time at all. I work full-time, but my work enables me to work in the way that's good for me to maximize the things that impact me outside of work. I am that person who goes to the park with my 3 kids and people stop me and say, oh, you're looking after the kids today. No, they're my kids. I'm not hired help. So I just think there's a wider cultural piece to do around flexible working is about positively moving work forward. But I think there's still this idea that flexible working is a nice thing to help mums work part-time, and I'm not sure it's the same thing.
Yeah, that's really good. And we'll hear more from Matthew and Heather a little bit later on about their experience. Thank you indeed for that.
Could I just
Please do.
respond to that? I think your point about culture is absolutely key to all of this. And I was thinking at one of the questions earlier, if it's modelled from the top, if somebody senior, whether male or female, is actually prepared to do it, I think that can be the most powerful message. And I also wonder about the terminology. I was talking to one of our members, a man, and who works for Barclays, and he was saying that they've stopped calling it flexible working. They now refer to agile working or dynamic working. But it just takes it into a different space that kind of, you shouldn't have to call it something different, but maybe some of these things sort of help get away from what you've just said, people just thinking it's for part-time mothers. So, yeah.
Sounds a bit more macho,
It does.
agile.
Well, yeah, I mean, for a woman as well, it sounds just a bit more kind of, yeah. Anyway.
Okay, so you heard it here first. We'll get people talking. That's what we're getting. Hashtag let's all flex together. It's going to be change the words. Okay, yes. Just wait till we get the microphone to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Talia Carr and I work as a coach. And my question really is around the support that people get when they try to decide whether they should be doing flexible working, when they transition to doing flexible working, and when they are flexibly working. Because I think I love the idea of flexible working. I flexibly work myself. I first was able to do that when I wanted to work for a charity 1 day a week. And so I found a job that could do 4 days. So that was perfect for me. Nothing to do with being a mum. But I think I work with quite a few people who are overwhelmed by the amount of work that they have to do. And it seems like a good solution to maybe cut your hours, do something from home. That's not always the best solution. It could be a bit of an easy opt-out. So I'd really be interested to know what the panel think about the support side of.
Well, I guess the risk is that you cut down to 4 days, but you're doing 5 days of work within 4, and then you're not getting paid. So that's not great. And also, potentially, people are getting stressed about that and resentful. They end up leaving because they don't like the arrangement. And I think that employers need to be constantly having these conversations with their employees. And they should be doing that anyway. They have a duty of care to look after their the well-being of their employees, and if their workload is too much for them, they should be on notice of that and trying to support them through that. So
it's so difficult though, isn't it? Because very often if you come to your employer and say, actually, I'm not coping with this amount of work, it feels like a admission of failure, and you're made to feel like that. That's part of the culture as well that needs to be tackled, isn't it?
I think one of the interesting points for me is that actually I'm not sure enough support is given to managers to know how to manage people flexibly as well. There was an organisation that I kind of knew pretty well a couple of years ago, 30 IT consultants. They didn't have an office. They were spread out all around the country, and they used to coalesce on a client site to do a project. Incredibly difficult situation to manage, because actually the managers weren't taught how to engage with their staff in that sort of way. So actually I think more support needs to be given up there, which I think will then help the flexibly working employees to be supported.
I heard a really good piece of advice that one of my colleagues who already works 4 days a week gave to another one who was considering it, and it wasn't for childcare reasons. And she said to him, make sure that you have something concrete planned for your 5th day, at least in the beginning, so that you are doing a thing and that work can't kind of like bleed into that spare day. So you establish a routine up front. And I think that was very good advice.
I think your point is really important, and it feels like at the moment it's employees who have to initiate this, these discussions. So my instinctive response is kind of more conversations within organisations, amongst managers, about what options are available and who's tried what and what might work would be really useful. And I think support at all the stages you've identified is probably really important.
is even
And isn't-
working right in this situation,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The TUC's even raised the whole issue of a 4-day
Oh,
week
yeah.
as being the
Mm.
norm for so
Uh-huh.
many people, hasn't it? I wonder what impact that would have on the number of people who work flexibly. You never know. Okay, we've got, I'm going to go 5 minutes into our coffee break time, if that's okay with everyone. Because I would like to take a couple of very brief questions. Anybody on this side? I'm conscious we haven't had any over here. We'll come back to you. We'll go to the gentleman in the pink shirt back here, if we may. Thank you very much. Thank you for handling the mics. There's one over here for you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Paul Wolford, OE Consulting. I wanted to ask the panel, what was the most creative process or a solution that they've seen employed to encourage flexible working or to make flexible working work? You know, we're talking about maybe going to reduced hours or reduced days, but that doesn't seem very creative. Is there anything really creative that you've seen?
Well, the best one in my own organisation, so we only have about 34 employees, and we have a team of consultants who work with our partners and members and support them around disability issues. And one of them, very highly valued consultant, a couple of years ago said he'd like to move to Spain, but could he carry on working for us? His wife is Spanish and they have 2 young children. And we've worked it so that he works from Spain. He comes to the UK once a month, so 3 weeks out of 4 he's in Spain. The other week he's here. He makes sure that on that week he's here, he's very present in the office. He sees people a lot. I often say, and not jokingly, that I see him more than a lot of the people who are actually based in the same office that I am. But we have Skype for Business set up, and we have it set up so that his internal extension goes direct, so you don't even have to know if he's in the UK or in Spain, and it works brilliantly.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And we'll probably take your final question from you. We'll just get the microphone down to the.
Yeah, I just really want to
Get the microphone too, so we can all hear you online as well.
My name's Pauline Broad. I am a management consultant, and I have helped lots of organisations through change of flexible working, where they've been looking to introduce different ways of working. And it was just really just to share a point that one of the things I found is flexible working doesn't work in isolated cases where there's maybe just 1 or 2 people that are working flexibly. It's about a new way of working within the organisation. And organisations that have been more successful have agreed defined ways of working. And that is around things like communication, rhythm and routines. We talked earlier on about not having office meetings where you pull people into a room and you exclude those flexible workers, having established boundaries and expectations agreed across the organisation. And that then builds on your point around it's not just for women, it's for men as well. It's encouraging a new way of working. And it is an acknowledgement that this is a change process within an organisation. It's not just something that can be done for the minority. It has to drive the culture, it has to drive the change. And the organisations that are successful, those that understand this doesn't happen on day one. It's an evolving piece of work. And I think there's not enough organisations that think of it in that way. So building on your point, Helen, about having a day where we get employers think about this, we need to help them through this as a process.
Yeah, lead the way. That's a great point. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, final thoughts as we break for coffee. If anybody who's watching online or indeed with us now who is considering working flexibly or looking for options that will work for them, is there a piece of advice that each of you could offer? I'll start with you, Diane.
The employee or the employer?
For the employee.
For the employee. I think make your business case and focus on the fact that you will be productive and you'll be working the way that is most effective and efficient for you, and that will then translate into being most effective and efficient for your employer, and that goes to their bottom line.
And the employer?
For the employer, I'd say don't exclude talent. And that goes for whether it's men, women, disabled people, whoever you're thinking of. Don't exclude people by being too rigid. Think about outcomes, think about the best possible candidate for your job.
Brilliant. Nigel, advice?
I think I'd look at 3 things. One is how best you should collaborate. You want to collaborate, whether that's on files or through instant messaging. There's some really innovative technologies out there that can really help with that. So collaboration, number one. Secondly, with a dispersed workforce, security becomes more of an activity that needs to be managed and thought about. And lastly, it's back to that internet connectivity point and thinking about some ways in which you can address that.
Okay, great, Victoria.
I think it's sort of echoing what has already been said about doing your homework and doing your research, and actually thinking of all those possible arguments that the employer or obstacles that the employer might come up with against your request, and really thinking about how that could be accommodated, and maybe even speaking to colleagues in advance of that, and you know, talking it through with them, so that you can say, well, look, my colleagues have agreed that they can, you know, pick up on a Tuesday when I'm not there, and you know, so just do your homework. I mean, I think for the employer, just yeah, exactly, and then I think for the employer, just be open-minded and think about all the positives of you know, of flexibility, rather than thinking, you know, it's a bad thing.
And Louise, final thought.
I'd echo the open-minded response that we would want from an employer. From an employee's perspective, I think it's have a stock take about what you want from your working life, and what else there might be out there that you want to do and be involved in, and perhaps not think of it as the only thing you have to be doing for umpty years.
Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts and indeed for your questions. We're going to take a short, about 15-minute break. At 10:02, we'd like everyone to come back in. We'll have our next session. We're going to hear a personal experience about what it's like to have flexible working from a couple, and then we'll have another panel session. But for now, I'd like to thank Louise, Victoria, Nigel, and of course, Deborah for talking to us today. Thank you ever so much.